She invited her black maid son to play chess, just to humiliate him in front of Beverly Hills elite. What she didn't know was that he'd spent 8 years preparing for this very moment. The chandelier sparkled like a crown above them, casting golden light over the marble floor and the velvet gowns of Beverly Hills' finest. Laughter floated through the air like champagne bubbles, refined, expensive, and slightly hollow. In the midst of it all, Carmen moved quietly between the guests, balancing flutes of sparkling rosé on a silver tray. No one looked at her. That was the point. She wasn't meant to be seen. Her son, Diego, 17 years old with shoulders just beginning to carry the weight of the world, followed close behind, offering tiny plates of bruschetta to people who barely acknowledged his existence. He wore a white shirt and black slacks, borrowed from a thrift store, pressed by his mother that morning with loving precision. Then the voice cut through the clatter like a knife on glass. "Come here, boy," Victoria Whitman called out, her tone sugar-coated with cruelty. She didn't look at Carmen, she never did. "Why don't you show us how you people play chess in the slums?" The room went still for a heartbeat, then laughter erupted, discreet, practiced, polite enough to be deniable, sharp enough to draw blood. Diego stopped mid-step. Carmen froze. She gripped the tray tighter, fingers whitening. 20 years in this house, and her son was still furniture to these people. Victoria sat like a queen at the center of the living room, legs crossed, diamonds winking at her ears, beside an ornate Italian chessboard set atop a custom mahogany table. It was supposed to be decorative. Tonight it was ammunition. "Go on," she added, tilting her head as if she were offering a prize. "I'm sure the boy knows how to move a pawn, maybe even without eating it." A man near the fireplace chuckled and pulled out a $100 bill. "I bet this kid won't last 10 moves." His wife sipped her champagne without looking up. 10, you're being generous." Victoria laughed and waved her manicured hand. "Carmen, let him play, it'll be educational for both of you." The way she said educational made Carmen want to vanish. Diego, however, didn't move, not at first. He simply looked at Victoria, then at the board, then at every guest in the room one by one. His eyes, dark and unreadable, lingered on each of them just long enough to make them uneasy. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. "Of course, ma'am," he said. "It would be my honor." The laughter dimmed. Something about the way he said it, too steady, too composed, made a few heads turn. Victoria smirked, unaware. "Excellent," she purred. "Let's see if the street teaches anything other than basketball." She gestured to the board, gleaming under the chandelier like a battlefield waiting for war. Diego set the tray down carefully. Carmen tried to catch his eyes, but he didn't look at her. He was already calculating. Not the chess moves, not yet. He was calculating the temperature of the room, the weight of the air, the exact moment when the laughter would stop. Room seemed to hold its breath as Diego stepped forward, each footstep soft against the polished marble, echoing louder than the murmurs that had filled the space moments before. He didn't walk like someone summoned. He walked like someone choosing where to stand. The guests shifted slightly, glasses paused midair, conversations suspended. No one expected him to respond that way. No panic, no protest, just calm, deliberate calm. Diego stopped in front of the chessboard, his eyes scanning the room again, not nervously, analytically, as if each face was a puzzle to solve, each smirk a move to be countered. His gaze landed on Victoria Whitman. He held it there, not with defiance, not with fear, just a silence that said more than any retort ever could. Then, with the grace of someone raised to respect even those who don't deserve it, he dipped his head slightly and spoke. "It would be my honor, ma'am." His voice was steady, no tremble, no irony. Just calm respect that didn't feel submissive, it felt dangerous. Victoria smiled, satisfied, but something in the room shifted. A few guests blinked, unsure why the hairs on their necks stood up. Carmen, standing by the edge of the room, didn't move. She couldn't. Her body was rigid, tray still in hand, but her eyes were locked on her son. Her fingers trembled. They always did when she felt exposed. But her eyes, they didn't tremble. They held something different now. A flicker. A light, hope maybe, or recognition. Recognition of a moment that had been building for years. Victoria gestured to the white side of the board and sat, legs crossed, smile effortless. "I always play white," she said. "Family tradition." Diego didn't respond. He stepped around the table and took his seat opposite her. His hands moved slowly, aligning each piece with surgical precision, the way a soldier might prepare for battle, not because he expects to lose, but because he refuses to win sloppily. The marble gleamed under the lights, each piece carved in Italy, worth more than what Carmen had earned in a year. Victoria twirled her queen between her fingers like a toy. "He's being dramatic," someone whispered behind a glass of wine. "I bet he doesn't even know which piece is the rook." but no one laughed this time, not out loud. Diego placed the final pawn with care and folded his hands on the edge of the table. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He had already said everything in the way he looked at her, not as an opponent, not even as a threat, just as someone whose turn it was to move. And still, he didn't smile. There was no need. The kind of smile Diego carried, sharp, cold, and exact, wasn't something you gave away lightly. It was something you saved for when the board answered back. Victoria leaned forward with theatrical flair, her fingers hovering over the pieces like a concert pianist about to strike the first note. She smiled at the audience, a perfectly curated grin meant to say this is harmless fun, nothing more. Then she picked up her pawn and moved it confidently to e4. Classic opening, she announced to no one in particular, loud enough for everyone to hear. King's pawn. First lesson at Harvard's social club. A few guests chuckled politely. Glasses clinked. Someone whispered, "Here we go." Diego didn't respond. He simply looked at the board. Then, without hesitation, he moved his own pawn to c5. The room didn't go silent, but it changed. Not everyone noticed, but Hamilton did. He was standing near the fireplace, sipping whiskey more out of habit than thirst. He squinted at the board, lowered his glass an inch, and muttered, "That's the Sicilian Defense." The words weren't meant for anyone, but the guest beside him leaned closer. "Is that bad?" "It's not beginner's chess," Hamilton said, eyes fixed on Diego. "It's aggressive and deep. That's not a move you just guess." Victoria blinked, her smile held but the edges cracked slightly. "Oh," she said with forced amusement, "we have a scholar in the room." Diego said nothing. He didn't even look up. He wasn't being rude, he was being efficient. Like someone following steps he had rehearsed 1,000 times, in rooms no one had ever seen. Carmen watched from the corner, barely breathing. She had seen that look on her son's face once before, when he was 12 and entered a citywide math competition. He had been the only black child in the room, the only one without a private tutor, the only one with worn-out sneakers. He didn't win. He destroyed. That same stillness in his eyes, focused, emotionless, surgical, was back now, and Carmen knew something was happening, something no one in that room understood yet. Victoria moved her knight to f3. Predictable. Social club predictable. Diego didn't pause. He played d6, reinforcing the center, slowly building a fortress. Hamilton's brows furrowed deeper. "He's not just copying," he whispered. "He's building structure with purpose." "Oh, come on," a woman nearby replied, watching Victoria sip her wine like a queen. "It's a game. Let the boy enjoy his moment." "That's not what this is," Hamilton said, more to himself than anyone. "He's not here to enjoy anything." The murmurs grew softer, eyes narrowed. The weight in the room shifted one grain at a time. Some still smiled, some still smirked, but a few, just a few, began to watch Diego differently. Carmen saw it too, in the way a woman lowered her champagne glass without drinking, in the way one man adjusted his cufflinks but didn't look away from the board. And Diego, he just played, quietly, methodically, as if he wasn't there to win a game but to correct something. A misunderstanding. A misjudgment. A myth. The myth that a maid's son, brought out for amusement, wouldn't know how to respond. He did, with the Sicilian, and silence. It had been an ordinary Tuesday when Diego found the book. He was 9. The public library's trash bin was overflowing, weathered magazines, torn covers, water-damaged textbooks that nobody wanted. He wasn't looking for treasure. He was looking for paper his mother could use for grocery lists. But then, wedged between a rolled-up atlas and a coffee-stained romance novel, he saw it. A chess book. Pages bent, the cover barely attached. But inside, diagrams, notations. Strange codes like E4 and NF6. It felt like a secret language, one he wasn't supposed to understand. He slipped it into his backpack and walked the 3 miles home like he was carrying something fragile and sacred. Their apartment was small, 2 rooms, 1 bed, a cracked window that whistled when the wind blew too hard. That night, the power had been cut off again. Carmen had left for her second shift at the diner, shoes taped at the heel. Diego lit a candle. He sat on the floor with the chess book open and copied positions onto a cardboard sheet he had drawn into 64 squares with a pencil stub. He didn't know the rules yet, only that the pieces moved in specific ways, that there was something beautiful in the symmetry. He read every word by candlelight. He fell asleep that way, curled on the floor beside cardboard kings and knights, the wax burning low. No one taught him. No one had to. The board became his second language. By the time he turned 11, he could recall full games from memory. At 12, he borrowed a broken laptop from a neighbor, taught himself how to repair it using YouTube videos watched over the public library's Wi-Fi. At 13, he downloaded PDFs of Grandmaster matches and studied them like scripture. The bishop wasn't just a piece, it was timing. The rook was pressure, the pawn was patience. But the queen, that was power. And Diego learned to move her like a blade. On his 15th birthday, there was no cake. Carmen had come home late, eyes swollen from grease fumes and exhaustion. Diego was waiting at the table with a drawing he had made of them both, a stick figure version of her in an apron, holding hands with a taller one in a graduation cap. "We don't have much," she said, apologizing without words. He shook his head. "I don't need cake, Mom." She smiled, trying not to cry. "You sure?" He looked at her, and in that moment his voice changed. It had a weight it hadn't carried before. "One day," he said, they'll know who you are because I'm going to show them who you raised." She had heard many promises in her life, but that one stuck, maybe because he didn't say it with anger. He said it like a vow, not to hurt anyone, but to honor something, not to rise above them, but to rise with her. That night she held his hand as they watched the candle flicker on the windowsill. No electricity, no gifts. Just two people who had chosen not to disappear. Now, years later, under the gleam of chandeliers and the gaze of the powerful, that same boy sat across from a woman who thought this was a game. He wasn't playing to win. He was playing to fulfill a promise made in the dark, where no one had been watching. Back in the room of chandeliers and wine, the pieces kept moving. Victoria leaned back in her chair with casual confidence, one leg crossed over the other, a glass of sparkling water resting beside her untouched. She played fast, but not too fast, just enough to look composed. She moved her bishop and tapped a nail on the table, glancing around as if expecting applause. Diego watched, not just the board, everything, every twitch of her fingers, every whisper across crystal glasses. Then he reached out and moved his pawn to G6. It was subtle, almost careless. A beginner's move if taken at face value. Victoria's eyes lit up. "Ah," she said, her tone sweetened with condescension. "Too eager, typical." Someone laughed from behind her. He blinked, another whispered, "Told you it was just for show." Diego didn't look up. He kept his gaze on the board, hands folded again, but across the room. Hamilton suddenly shifted. The glass in his hand stopped halfway to his lips. He took a step forward, frowning, staring at the position. "Wait a second," he muttered. "That's he setting up the dragon." A guest beside him turned. "The what?" "The Dragon Defense," Hamilton said, more to himself. "Sicilian variation, it's not for amateurs." A woman nearby lowered her champagne. "Are you saying he knows what he's doing?" Hamilton didn't answer. He walked slowly toward the board. As he drew closer, his expression turned from casual curiosity to focused suspicion. Diego remained unmoved. Victoria, still unaware, smirked and spoke to the crowd. "He plays fast, doesn't he? Real chess takes thought." "No," Hamilton said under his breath. "This is thought, just hidden." Diego moved his knight, then his bishop, each piece placed with exact geometry as if the marble board were familiar to his hands. The positions began forming patterns, coordinated lines, structured defenses, dark square control. Victoria responded. But now she hesitated half a second longer, not because she was afraid, not yet, but because some instinct whispered that the game was no longer about entertainment. Another guest stepped closer, abandoning her glass completely. The murmurs in the room quieted. What had started as a joke now felt heavier, like something else was being revealed move by move. Carmen watched from her place near the wall. Her hands no longer trembled. Her eyes locked on her son's face. She didn't see arrogance or rebellion. She saw discipline, precision. A boy who had memorized shapes in candlelight now composing a silent symphony across a board his opponent thought was hers. Diego paused, not because he needed to, but because it helped the illusion. He tilted his head slightly, stared at the pieces as if unsure, then made a move so calmly it looked accidental. But Hamilton's eyes widened. "It's a trap," he whispered. "He's baiting her." Victoria missed it. She smiled. "Predictable," she said, but it wasn't, not at all. Diego didn't react. No grin, no satisfaction. Just the same stillness he had arrived with, because this wasn't about shocking anyone. It wasn't about revenge or applause. He wasn't proving anything. He was demonstrating something, something timeless, something quiet, the truth, and he was doing it one piece at a time. By the 23rd move, the laughter had disappeared. So had the wine, so had the ease. No one spoke, they just watched. Like spectators in a courtroom waiting for the verdict they didn't realize had already been written. Victoria's hand hovered above the board. Her fingers trembled slightly, her smile long gone. There was no script for this moment, no charming comment to fill the silence. On the marble board, her queen stood exposed, cornered by an invisible noose. Diego's last move had created a double threat. If she moved to protect her king, her queen would fall. If she saved the queen, her king would be lost in 3 moves. There was no way out, not without losing a part of herself. Diego didn't lean back, he didn't smirk. He simply sat there, his fingers laced, eyes still and focused, like a surgeon watching the last stitch pull tight. Carmen stood in the same place, hands clasped tightly at her waist. Her heart beat so loudly she was sure someone would hear it, but no one looked at her. They were all still locked on the boy in the black shirt, the one they thought was a servant, the one they'd invited into their ring of polished power for entertainment. He wasn't performing, he was judging. Victoria finally moved. Her knight slid to the side in what looked like an escape, but wasn't. Diego had calculated this 6 moves ago. It only confirmed what he already knew. That she hadn't understood the game. Not really. He reached forward, moved his queen 1 square with deliberate calm and leaned back. 3 lines opened instantly, 3 ways to finish, 3 silent paths to the same destination. He didn't announce it, not yet. Instead, he stood. The room stirred. A few guests blinked as if waking from hypnosis. Diego didn't walk toward Victoria. He turned away from the board, crossed the floor, and stopped beside his mother. Carmen looked up at him, eyes glassy with unshed tears. He spoke softly, just loud enough to carry through the breathless hush. "Do you remember, Mom?" he asked. "When I told you I'd make them see?" Carmen couldn't speak for a second, her throat locked, but then she nodded. "I remember," she whispered. "They're seeing now, Mijo, they're all seeing." Diego nodded, then turned back to the board. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He looked at Victoria, who now sat frozen, unable to hide the panic rising behind her carefully painted face. Her hand twitched toward her wineglass, then stopped. Her lips parted, but no words came. Diego's voice was quiet, but in that room it was the only sound that mattered. "Check," he said, a single word. It echoed louder than applause. Hamilton closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and whispered, "It's over." Victoria stared at the board like it had betrayed her, like the pieces had moved on there. Like this wasn't supposed to happen, but it had. She looked at Diego, but he didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The silence in the room did the talking. The guests weren't looking at Victoria anymore. They were looking at him, not with amusement, not even with surprise, with reverence, with awe, with shame. Carmen stepped forward, placing a hand on her son's shoulder. It was a quiet gesture, but it shook the room harder than any speech could. For 20 years she had served in this house, invisible, silent, necessary, and now. Son she raised was standing tall in the very center of everything that had tried to keep them small. Victoria opened her mouth again, but Diego raised a hand gently, as if to stop her from speaking what didn't matter. "You don't need to explain," he said. "The board already did." Then he sat back down, fingers on the edge of the table, and waited, not for her move, there were none left, but for her to understand what had just happened. This wasn't a game, it was history. And it had just been rewritten. The room didn't explode, it imploded. One by one the guests began to shift. A man adjusted his tie, suddenly too tight. A woman beside the piano placed her glass down without drinking. Near the fireplace, a couple exchanged a glance, something between discomfort and disbelief. And then slowly, like a curtain lowering after a failed play, they began to leave, not all at once, but in a silent procession of cold handshakes and clipped goodbyes. No music played. No laughter lingered, only the ticking of a grandfather clock that now sounded much too loud. Victoria sat still, eyes darting between faces that refused to meet hers. The silence weighed heavier than any insult. She tried to hold on to what was left of the evening of herself. "This was a setup," she snapped, standing abruptly. Her voice broke the room like a crack of lightning in dry air. "You were trained. Someone coached you to humiliate me." She pointed at Diego as if he were a conspiracy. "No one learns to play like that alone. You came here to make a fool of me." Diego didn't move. His face remained calm, the same stillness that had unnerved them all night. "Would you like to play again?" he asked, his voice quiet but unwavering. "Or I could play everyone here at once if you prefer." The room shifted again. A murmur spread. The suggestion sounded impossible, but after what they had witnessed. No one laughed. Victoria's face flushed. "You're being arrogant," she hissed. "You're just a boy from the slums. You don't speak to your betters that way." That's when Carmen stepped forward. For the first time in 2 decades of working in that house, she stood not as a maid, but as a mother, as a witness, as someone who had nothing left to fear. "My son is not from the slums," she said, her voice clear and steady. "He's from a home built on sacrifice, on respect, on love." Her eyes locked with Victoria's. "He doesn't play to humiliate people. He plays to honor the years you never saw, and the dignity you never gave." There was no applause, only silence. And in that silence, something far louder than shame began to settle over the room. A reckoning, a shift. Victoria opened her mouth again but found no audience. Even Hamilton, her friend of decades, looked away. His wife, once glued to her phone, now stood beside Carmen with a solemn nod. Diego remained seated, but in that moment he towered above the room, not in height, in truth. Victoria had come dressed like royalty, but now her diamonds seemed dull. Her gown couldn't cover the unraveling. She had not been humiliated by a boy. She had exposed herself, and no one could look away from that. Not anymore. 6 months later, the old Italian chessboard reappeared, but this time not in the marble salon of a Beverly Hills mansion. It was frozen on the screen of a CNN segment titled, "The Young Mastermind Who Silenced a Room Without Raising His Voice." A clip played of Diego Santos, now seated in a quiet Stanford courtyard, the same calm in his eyes, the same posture, only now wearing a red university jacket with the Stanford seal embroidered across the chest. He didn't look like a prodigy. He looked like someone who had simply known where he was going long before the rest of the world caught on. The interviewer leaned forward, holding a tablet that showed a still image of that night, the moment his queen cornered Victoria's king. "Do you feel proud?" she asked. "You took on the most powerful woman in that room and, well, checkmated more than just her position." Diego didn't smile. He didn't need to. "I wasn't trying to defeat her," he said quietly. "I was honoring something, a promise. I don't hold grudges. They take up too much space on the board." The interviewer paused, then nodded. "And what now?" Diego looked toward the campus buildings behind him. "Now I build something of my own. No one has to lose for others to win." In the weeks after the match, the ripple effect had moved faster than Victoria's PR team could spin. The video, quietly filmed by Congresswoman Mills, had gone viral within days. Not because it showed a boy beating a millionaire at chess, but because it showed a room full of people realizing too late who the real queen was. Headlines followed. "Prodigy silences privilege. Maid's son redefines power in Beverly Hills. One move that changed everything." Invitations flooded in: interviews, scholarships, speaking engagements. But Diego accepted only one, a full scholarship to Stanford, where he now studied engineering and cognitive science. In his spare time, he founded an online program called 64 Squares, a free platform connecting underprivileged kids to chess mentors from top universities. Within 5 months, over 1,500 children had joined, not to win trophies, to think, to dream, to see the board differently. Carmen, too, had stepped into a new chapter. Offered a supervisor position at a 5-star hotel in Santa Monica, she now earned triple what she made before, with full benefits and respect that no longer came with conditions. She still packed Diego's care packages, handwritten notes tucked between textbooks and packets of instant coffee. And sometimes she still lit a candle by the window at night, out of habit, out of memory, out of quiet pride. Victoria Whitman, on the other hand, had vanished from the spotlight. The country club removed her name after board members received hundreds of protest emails. 3 of her long-standing charities removed her from their advisory boards, citing misalignment of values. Even Hamilton stopped returning her calls. In one rare photo, she was seen at a private lunch in Malibu, sunglasses on, staring at her phone while no one sat at her table. But Diego never mentioned her again. When asked, he simply said, "Some lessons cost more than others." In the final moments of the CNN segment, the interviewer asked what he would say to any child who felt overlooked, underestimated, or invisible. Diego paused. Then he said, "Don't wait for permission to be brilliant. Move like you've already earned the right." That night, Carmen framed a new photo, Diego at Stanford, smiling just slightly, a chessboard beside him and sunlight in the background. Below it, she placed his first tournament certificate. Not because of the win, but because it reminded her of a boy who once lit a candle, opened a torn book, and promised the darkness that it wouldn't last. And true to his word, he didn't fight the darkness. He outmaneuvered it, piece by piece, move by move, until there was nowhere left for it to go. Checkmate. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.